Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the very first HALLO Compliance Network virtual meetup. I am Zoltán Tündi, co-founder at Hipter, initiators and owners of HALLO. And it's my absolute pleasure to host this inaugural session and have this welcome note. So today marks the beginning of what promises to be an enlightening journey throughout the intersecting worlds of gambling, blockchain, fintech, and artificial intelligence. HALLO, highly aligned leaders in legal operation, is more than just an acronym. It's one of our missions, where we create a trusted network of legal experts who are not only specialists in their fields, but also passionate about bridging the gap between emerging technology and the law. So our meetups are powered by our outlets, such as European Gaming, Gaming Americas, the Picante Network, and are curated to bring you the latest and most relevant information. These sessions are a testament to our commitment to keeping you at the forefront of legal operations and compliance. So why HALLO Compliance? Because the world where technology evolves at a breakneck speed, staying legally informed is not just an advantage, it's already a necessity. So here you will have access to a wealth of knowledge, network with peers, and learn from industry leaders, ensuring that your operations remain compliant and ahead of curve. So as we embark on this journey together, I invite you to engage, ask questions, and share your insight. Your contributions are what will make these meetups a rich source of knowledge. This is a recorded version for those who are now listening to this video or viewing this video. Make sure to subscribe to be notified about the next meetups. And thank you for joining us today. Let's set the stage for a future where technology and compliance coexist in harmony. And let's make it happen together. Welcome to the HALLO Compliance Network. Today, Annemarie will kick things off. She will be the moderator of these awesome sessions. So Annemarie, I will not take further away time from you and just leave you to it.
Thank you very much, Sultan, for this intro, and good morning, good late morning to our audience and to my co-speakers. Dr. Mark Griffiths, he is psychologist and professor at the Nottingham Trent University. He is doing research in the field of behavioral addiction, among which gambling and gaming, for already 37 years, and he's hence one of the most renowned researchers in this area. Dr. Alan Littler, he is gambling lawyer at Kavkats and Franzen in Amsterdam, and he follows regulatory and legislative developments in the iGaming sector for many, many years. He also helped clients through the not too easy licensing process in Holland, and he will share today the knowledge about advertising. Then we have Peter Paul de Goij. He is Secretary General at NOGA, the Dutch trade association for licensed iGambling operators. And last but not least, Dr. Andreas Wörlein. He's a gambling lawyer at Melchers Attorneys at Law in Germany. And he's also a lecturer at the University of Applied Management in Frankfurt. And he also regularly publishes on different legal topics in regards to iGambling. We will speak today about one of the most discussed and contested topics in iGambling for the last, let's say, 5 years. Although advertising provisions weren't that strict during, let's say, a decade in Europe, around 2018, 2019, this approach changed quite substantially. And Italy was in 2019 the first jurisdiction to ban most forms of advertising. And meanwhile, we see restrictions pretty much everywhere, and also bans are being discussed nearly globally, whether in Australia, whether in Latin and South America, and in many other regions as well. We want to explore today the latest developments and experiences with them. We want to dive into what is on the table and how one could possibly change the current path towards more and more restrictions. Let me start with you, Andreas. Germany has been pretty much the last big country to open up for a multi-licensing framework. So Germany would have had a lot of opportunities to study different models across the world pretty much. Also, frameworks that exist for over a decade already. How did Germany finally decide to frame advertising for online gambling?
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Zoltan, and thank you, Annemarie. Germany's quite interesting topic right now because the new interstate treaty on gambling has been in force for just over 2 years now and has brought several significant changes to the market, to the German market. And this applies in particular to the regulation of advertising, as you already mentioned. And that's because for the first time ever in Germany, many types of gambling, especially online gambling, can be offered legally. And if we take a brief look into the past under the regime of the Interstate Treaty 2012, we find an extensive ban on online gambling, as well as a so-called experimental clause for sports betting, which failed completely. And now, under the regime of the new Interstate Treaty, the first licenses for sports betting, virtual slot machines, and online poker have been granted. The current stand of the whitelist shows us that we have about 40 operators with a license for virtual slot machines, 30 licenses for sports betting, and 5 for online poker. So this fundamental change has significantly affected the regulation of gambling advertising. And while advertising and sponsorship was generally prohibited under the regime of the Interstate Treaty 2012, it is now generally permitted according to the new Section 5, Paragraph 1, Sentence 1. And however, advertising and sponsorship for unlicensed gambling offers remain illegal. If we take a closer look at this new Section 5 Interstate Treaty 2021, we can see that the various types of gambling are regulated differently. And that's quite interesting. And for example, advertising for virtual slot machines, online poker, and online casino games via radio or internet is prohibited between 6 a.m. and 9 p.m. And according to the explanation of the Interstate Treaty, this restriction is intended to take into account the increased risk of gambling addiction presented by these offers in the opinion of the legislator. And at the same time, it is a measure to protect minors. Sports betting, on the other side, is not covered by this restriction. However, the following applies here. Advertising for sports betting on the particular sporting event is prohibited on the broadcasting channel immediately before and during the live broadcast of sporting events. And furthermore, according to the new Section 5, Paragraph 3, Sentence 3, I think, active athletes and officials may no longer be used for advertised sports betting. That's also quite a new thing for us here in Germany. And finally, it should be added that in addition to this Section 5, operators must comply with extensive ancillary provisions from the licenses granted, how, when, where advertising is allowed, and so on. Here too, there are differences depending on the type of gambling. And these provisions cover several pages of the license and are strictly monitored by our new joint gambling authority, the GGL, which is based in Halle. And in addition to these various regulations, there are also a number of other special features in terms of advertising law, which we could perhaps discuss in the course of the panel. But for now, I think that's a short summary of the current stand here in Germany.
So what I find interesting in regard to Germany, from the very beginning, they foresaw different provisions for different products, depending on how they define their risk. Mark, this is something we do not find in other jurisdictions that much. Do you think that this is a new and good approach?
Well, obviously, I say I've been 3.5 decades in the field now. In the UK, we've seen more and more advertising, but we've not got what I would call differential advertising, apart from An interesting thing happened when the National Lottery was introduced back in 1994, because suddenly the government decided in the UK that the lottery really wasn't as risky as other forms of gambling. So they allowed the lottery to be advertised. And there is obviously a lot of evidence that, particularly things like bi-weekly games, there is very little evidence for problem gambling amongst those types of gambling. One of the reasons for that is that we know that, lotto types of gambling, the event frequency is only twice a week. You can't become addicted to something where you're only being rewarded a couple of times a week. Compare that with something like slot machines, where you can, in a pretty, an average British slot machine, you can gamble 10 or 12 times a minute. And so those 10 types of gambling tend to be more dangerous. When the National Lottery was introduced in 1994, the UK government decided the lottery could advertise. And then, of course, we got the football pools, which you can only gamble on once a week. They were given dispensation to advertise because it was seen as a soft form of gambling. But then, interestingly, scratch cards were advertised on TV in 1995 when they were introduced in the UK. But the Home Office at the time had a kind of definition of a difference between what they called hard and soft forms of gambling. And they said that hard forms of gambling, like casino games, couldn't be advertised on television, but things like the lottery could be advertised on television. And scratch cards, because they came under lottery products, were classed as soft forms of gambling. But the thing about scratch cards, of course, is if you have the time, the money and resources, you can gamble on scratch cards again and again and again. And in fact, scratch cards, under the old definition of what hard gambling was, actually were a hard form of gambling. So I think what Germany are doing at the moment, which is having differential forms of advertising for different risk products, is a good idea. That's if you believe in the general premise that you should have advertising in the first place. If you look over the last 2 years, for instance, there's been four major reviews that's looked at the impact of advertising on gambling and problem gambling. Okay, and what all those reviews have found is that the general thing is that there is an association between the amount of gambling advertising and the normalization of gambling. I mean, basically, the more gambling advertising you watch, the more normalized you become towards it. There is an association between the amount of, well, not the amount that people advertise, but there is certainly problem gamblers will often mention that advertising is a trigger for them gambling, and problem gamblers themselves, if you ask them about how aware they are of advertising, they're much more aware than people who are non-problem gamblers. But from my perspective, I always like to take a holistic view of this. And one of the things that we can say, and this is the interesting factor, I'll take the UK as an example. I think over the last 10 or 15 years, we've seen something like an 800% increase in advertising and marketing, but yet we've had no increase in the prevalence of problem gambling whatsoever. And in fact, on our latest figures, we went down slightly to 0.3%. I mean, we're one of the countries within Europe that has one of the lowest problem gambling prevalence rates. However, then people argue, well, if the prevalence of problem gambling isn't increasing, why should we, worry about advertising? And I suppose from my perspective is that for problem gamblers, if there's lots of advertising around, that can actually make their problems worse. And of course, problem gambling doesn't just affect that one individual; it affects those around around them as well. But the other thing with gambling, in terms of the research that's been done, there's been about 70 or so studies that's looked at the association between problem gambling and advertising. From my perspective, the quality of research, including my own, I've done 10 or so studies. The quality of research is very poor, particularly compared to the research that's looked at the links between advertising and alcohol use and advertising and tobacco. It seems that the researchers working in the gambling area are not using the most robust methodologies that are being used in other consumptive products that tend to cause problems. We've got no longitudinal research whatsoever. I mean, every single piece of research is cross-sectional. There is no research out there that shows that advertising causes problem gambling. There is just an association, and I don't want to diminish that association because that association is important and it's consistently been found. But the problem is, even if you had the best designed study in the world, you could not conclusively show that advertising on its own causes problem gambling. You know, and that's the problem with any type of advertising. These relationships are very, very complex.
Thank you, Mark, for this. And you already answered a further question of mine.
Okay.
I will come back to that.
Okay.
Less. From what you said in the first part, I understand you think it's definitely a good idea to also have a different approach corresponding to the so-called possible risk of a certain product. And you made a very good point when it comes to lotteries. Of course, lotteries mostly have different rules in place. And you also stressed a key component, namely the scratch cards, which are in principle kind of slots. And of course, they should have then different advertising provisions. Now, I want to switch a little bit to Holland, because in Holland, despite having heard now that there is, in fact, a very or not a too clear answer from research to which extent advertising really correlates with higher problem gambling rates. Why did Holland, after a very short period of an opening and competitive market, already decide this summer to ban most forms of advertising without having really the data to show that this is a must step to reduce whatever exposure to the public? Ellen.
Yes, I will say a few words about that, but thank you as well for the possibility to join today's panel. Yeah, so the Netherlands compared to the UK feels like a jurisdiction which is going through the motions at a very high speed. The market opened for licensed operators in October 2021 after an awful long period of legislative back and to in Parliament to get the legislation through and on the books, and all the secondary regulations lined up and so forth. And then indeed, it felt a little bit for some like as no sooner did the party start than, you know, it was already being told, turn down the volume. This is all a bit too much. So essentially, as of the 1st of July this year, it is prohibited for online operators and only online operators to conduct so-called untargeted advertising. That's quite interesting because in the regulations, there are 3 forms of gambling which are determined or categorized as being high risk. That's casino land-based, slot machine land-based, and online. But there's been a sort of differentiation made within those 3 for the further restrictions. What we saw that was once the market opened in October 2021, there was immediately a boom in advertising on television, and it was everywhere, a bit like it has been in the UK. And that caused an awful lot of irritation amongst, well, primarily parliamentarians who were very vocal about this. And perhaps perhaps it's not so much a question of the content of those advertisements, but just the volume, the sheer volume of them. And there were many restrictions in terms of, you know, watersheds, content, the use of role models, which within 9 months, 9 role models were prohibited. So you could no longer use a celebrity or well-known sports person. That came in very quickly, but purely due to the volume of the advertising, there was a backlash. And that was then furthered by research which showed that the number of young adults were disproportionately represented in the overall player population compared to how many young adults there are in the general population. And young adults are a so-called category of vulnerable persons. And from a responsible gambling perspective, the legislation has sort of made a carve out for vulnerable persons or categories of, and people falling within these categories are supposed to receive a higher level of protection. So for example, if you have responsible gambling measures, that those measures should be applied at an earlier stage for somebody who falls within such a category, or you should not target them with advertising, or you should not provide them with bonuses and so forth. So this cohort of players, 18 up until 23, or including 23-year-olds, were overly represented in the number of players compared to the overall population. And so that was another reason why there was a push for further restrictions, not only in terms of the content, but also in terms of where of advertising for online could be displayed. And so prior to the 1st of July this year, it was possible to advertise online gambling, at bus stops and tram stops, at stations and so forth. There were restrictions. It cannot be within so many 100 meters of a school or whatever. As of the 1st of July, that is prohibited. It's also prohibited to advertise online if you cannot filter out the vulnerable groups of people. So you have to be able to ensure that whether it's on social media, on an affiliate website, it doesn't matter, but you have to be able to filter out, take the best measures possible to filter out the vulnerable people. And then you also have to be able to show that at least 95% of those who visited each platform, affiliate website, or so forth, were actually over the age of 23, so 24 plus. So it's not a complete prohibition, perhaps as in Belgium, because I understand, looking at the Belgian legislation, that is pretty much a complete ban. This is not a complete ban, and this is something which, the ban came in on the 1st of July. So we have several months now that have reporting obligations to the authority in The Hague. It remains to be seen how effective the measures which affiliates are taking, or which operators are taking in relation to social media platforms, are in practice. Because for every month, the operator needs to be able to demonstrate that 95% of the people who viewed a particular advert online were indeed 24 plus. And there are many questions around how one goes about demonstrating that. The regulation, or the explanation in the regulations and the explanatory text, referred to the use of Google Analytics, but there are many challenges with using Google Analytics in this regard, so it remains to be seen whether, in practice, the gambling authority be willing to accept those, or whether the gambling authority will essentially expect the industry to do things which are impossible in practice, and therefore, via the back door, there will be a more or less total ban on online advertising. But at the moment, on paper, there isn't, but we need to see how the practice pans out to see whether it will, in effect, be a total ban.
Is it fair to say that it was also kind of a political decision, and not so much based on sufficient data that they acted so quickly?
Yeah, they recognized that there wasn't real data on this. But the line of thought was, and unfortunately the minister who's responsible for the gambling dossier sort of blows whichever way Parliament is thinking, and they basically said, okay, there is no data, but we don't want to wait for the data because we don't want the harms to arise. We're going to take action now, proactively, preventatively, and that's why they acted without there being real data as to the potential harms which advertising could cause.
Peter Paul, your members, I mean, they invested a lot of money to adjust their systems, to buy smaller operators in Holland, and under the premise that they would be able to advertise. And now, so quickly after licensing, they are confronted with these massive restrictions. As I understand also from Ellen, it had to do perhaps also a little bit with an abundant advertising right at the start. So how do your members view that? How is your position here?
Thanks, Annie. Thanks for having me on this webinar. The Netherlands has a habit to continuously move around the goalposts during the match. And this is just another example of this. It doesn't look really good on the Netherlands as a place to invest, because you're never secure whether you will be able to recoup your investment. And it has already led to gambling companies forsaking on the Dutch market, letting it go, because if you have a brand which has no recognition in the Netherlands, you don't have a chance to enter the market successfully today with these restrictions. And I think it's important to mention here that even before the market opened, from the side of some political parties, but especially the addiction treatment centers, they have been very vocal, warning against allowing advertising for online gambling altogether. It has been their goal, and they have almost reached it, unfortunately, to restrict and even ban advertising for online gambling. You know, in September, so the month before the market opened, there was a newspaper article in which two representatives of the addiction treatment centers were interviewed together with the Socialist Party MP and the Christian Union MP, and they were pleading for, you know, tough restrictions on advertising for online gambling, and even a ban, and this is exactly what happened. What also did not help, I mean, it's all in the eye of the beholder, of course. If you go from zero advertising for online gambling to a lot, you know, it will be perceived as a huge hike. But what we've seen in Sweden, for instance, that after, you know, 6 to 8 months, things were starting to slow down a bit. And as far as I'm correct here, I think the level of advertising in Sweden is fairly moderate. But in the Netherlands, we never got to wait for this. No. And what has happened now is that without there is any proof that this is leading to increased consumer protection, because in my view, this leads to less consumer protection, but I'll explain that in a minute. Without any evidence that it leads to consumers being protected, we banned it, yeah, it's looking very unfavorable at the moment. And there's an important point that I would like to make here, is that the effect of banning advertising for online gambling that it has on the licensed operators in comparison to the illegal gambling operators that continue to advertise online for their illegal offer. What's the effect of that? How are licensed companies protected from this unfair competition, really? So the Netherlands fails to answer that question. So it leads to less consumer protection, because if you do a search on Google in the Netherlands with a typical Dutch search term for online gambling, chances are fairly high that you end up with an illegal casino platform. So I don't see how this leads to protecting Dutch consumers at all.
That's a very interesting point, and a good point, because we have seen that in Italy already, that 4 years after the ban, a recent article in an Italian sports newspaper said that only this year 10,000 illegal websites had been blocked in Italy, and 1 billion in GTR got lost to the black market. And it's also interesting what you pointed out in regard to Sweden. Sweden, also, it has quite a relatively liberal law, has also a very liberal advertising law, and it does work nonetheless. Mark?
Yeah, and if I can add to that, Annie, so it sounds a lot, 10,000 websites, and you know, it is a lot if you compare it to you know, what the KSA is doing in that regard. But it's an uphill battle, to say it very politely, because, you know, worldwide there are hundreds of thousands of online gambling websites. So even if you block 10,000, that is just a drop in the ocean.
Yeah, no, absolutely right, and many cannot be even found. Mark, you just mentioned what I found super interesting. You said the approach to research in iGambling is not so, let's say it, reliable than for alcohol or tobacco. Now, but recently, many regulators start arguing and explaining it based on studies. And Also, Belgium did that, and they said there is this, they have commissioned studies, and there is this correlation between liberal advertising and higher prevalence rates. A recent Irish study says that, and at the same time, as you mentioned correctly, for instance, also in the UK, you have the lowest prevalence rate, or you have the prevalence rate which is as low as 10 years ago. And also in the House of Lords report of 21, they clearly say there is no correlation. How can it be avoided that research becomes just a ball between political interests?
I mean, obviously, I'm not a politician, but politicians do seize, what they, if publics have concerns, and I have to be honest, gambling in the UK is one of those things that does get headlines. It typically gets bad headlines. The problem we've got in the research field is that the quality of research is generally poor. I mean, hopefully with increased gambling funding, we will see better quality research over the year. There's a real cliche in the field that the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. So even though we haven't got the evidence that lots and lots of advertising causes problem gambling, as you say, and as I've said before right at the start, there is a clear association between problem gambling and advertising. But as I say, the overall prevalence rates, and I think the case is not just for the UK. You'll find that in most places, the prevalence of problem gambling anywhere in Europe is around anything between about 0.5% to maybe 2%, even in countries that don't have particularly good gambling regulation. And obviously that is hundreds of thousands of people, and obviously millions of people if you extrapolate it right across the world. I mean, the point that's just been made, one of the reasons you could argue for advertising is it does actually channel people towards regulated offers. We know that we've got lots of black market gambling, lots of black market gambling operators out there. I've always said, if your advertising brings you towards let's say an online gambling site that is heavily regulated by the regulator in that country, then those kinds of players are going to have lots more protection than going to an online gambling site that has little or no kind of record of having lots of responsible gambling tools. For instance, in the UK, the protection of gamblers is absolutely central to all the regulation for online gamblers now, and every online gambling operator operating under UK jurisdiction, they have to show what they're doing in terms of player protection, and it's demanded now that you use your data analytics to try and almost predict who is going to become problem gamblers, or use that data to spot problem gamblers. The fact now that we've got things like mandatory breaks, limit setting, personalized messaging, lots and lots of things that we know can have a positive impact in terms of protecting players. I mean, from my perspective, and I've done 6 or 7 research studies now looking at limit setting. I mean, if you are a gambler and you set your limits in terms of amount of time and money that you want to spend on a particular site, it doesn't matter how aggressive the advertising is, because once you've reached your limits, you can't gamble anymore. But of course, as just been mentioned, there are tens of thousands of sites out there. So even if you block yourself from one site or use that, you could potentially go on to another one. The problem with research is often 2 steps behind what the gambling industry doing. Regulation is often 2 steps behind in terms of what the gambling industry is doing. Research will only ever be as good as the funding that's available to do it. We are now moving towards a more polluter pays model, which in the UK, for instance, the gambling industry have to put money into research, education and treatment. But then you get some researchers that say, I'm not going to do research if it's directly or indirectly funded by industry donations. So now obviously we're talking about the statutory levy in the UK, and maybe 1% of all profits will go into research, education and treatment, which will increase the amount of money that can be done. But even when you increase the amount of money, you've then got to put in the bids, and advertising isn't necessarily one of those things that will necessarily be funded. I mean, these are always done on a competitive basis. It's always done, is your idea better than somebody else's? Is your track record better than somebody else's? As I say, in the history of the gambling studies field, and so I've been working for well over 3.5 decades, the fact that we've only got around 70 studies in that whole time shows you that advertising, for whatever reason, is just a really minute proportion of the amount of amount of research that's actually done in the area. But I don't, as I say, I don't think you will ever show conclusively that advertising affects or increases the prevalence of problem gambling, because there are just so many other confounding factors as well. You know, you can't, you know, because we know gambling is multifaceted, and what we call the acquisition, development, and maintenance of problem gambling relies on maybe 100 different factors at any one time. You've got the individual factors within yourself, your genetic or biological predisposition, your personality factors. You then add in the structural characteristics of the gambling activity itself. What's the jackpot prize? What's the stake prize? What's the event frequency? What's the speed of play? And then you add it to all the things that happen in the environment where you place your product, the marketing, the advertising. Advertising and marketing is just one small piece of this very, very big jigsaw. And yet, you know, regulators and government and politicians often focus on advertising because they think that that advertising piece of the jigsaw is much, much bigger than all those other pieces. And to be honest, I don't know whether there is evidence to actually say that.
Yeah, it sounds a little bit like that. And this seems also quite logical, what you say in regard to research on advertising. It's really very difficult to neutrally say which factors influence what. I want to switch a little bit the topic and get back to the law. What comes to my mind when I see different advertising provisions, that they are really very vague. For instance, also in the German law, it says moderate advertising, or it says gambling should not suggest an escape of problems, shall not target minors. Definitions that leave a lot of room for maneuver and make also, in my view, enforcement quite random. Andreas, what is your explanation that we have such vague definitions, which in my view also cause the problem of partially abundant advertising?
Yeah, that's actually a good question, and I fully agree what you already said. To start on a positive note, it must be mentioned that we have some comments with respect to these terms in the explanations of the interstate treaty, which can provide a bit better understanding. Unfortunately, this does not apply to all the terms, and it is also questionable to what extent the authority is guided by these specifications, because our impression as a law firm is that the authority responsible, the GGL, interprets these vague terms very strictly right now. And in my opinion, the legislator's intention was precisely to allow a broad interpretation or understanding to be able to react to changes in the market without having to amend the interstate treaty once again, as the legislator did already 4 or 5 times in the past. The current problem is that there are numerous lawsuits that are also directed against these ancillary provisions of the licenses in terms of advertising. And that leads me to the point you raised regarding enforcement. The authority is currently focusing on licensed operators and applies the new regulation very strictly, as I already mentioned. And this not only weakens the legal market, but also helps the illegal market to become more attractive to potential players. And this applies, for example, to the bonus regulation. To just give you one example, 100 euros per year. This is what is allowed right now in Germany. That cannot keep up with the illegal market. And advertising should be a powerful tool to direct players into the controlled and legal and safe market. And the problem that we have with advertising, unfortunately, applies to the enforcement against illegal operators in general. Just to give you one more example, the only enforcement instrument of the interstate treaty, the new one, that actually works is payment blocking, and the rest is very interesting, but in my opinion, not really working. So to answer your question, I wouldn't say it's random, but yes, right now we have a major problem with enforcement and the wrong focus on the operators who voluntarily submit to the regulation and want to comply with all the provisions of the interstate treaty. So finally, regarding the vague terms, it should be also mentioned that there are first court decisions here in Germany, but however, these court decisions remain very vague in the explanations and have so far not provided much clarification for operators. So I think there's still a long way to go. But yes, as you mentioned with your question, that's a big problem right now we have in Germany. So yeah, we will see what happens.
You say nonetheless, Andreas, there are kind of recommendations and further explanations how to interpret certain provisions. Also, for me, moderate advertising is one of those terms where I've said everything is allowed and nothing is allowed. But we find those provisions pretty much everywhere, and also in France. And since there was a lot of advertising also during the Euro 21 in France, the regulator did the following. They established a set of recommendations also to avoid exactly what you said, to have to review the law. And they specified very, very concretely what can be done and what can't be done. For instance, licensed operators need to submit their advertising strategy for the year prior to the release. There is also a cap on TV ads per day. So they become extremely clear what they want and what they don't want. And I think that is also a way to reduce fines for operators. They can also plan properly. Mark, and also a question to Paul. Peter Paul, do you think that could be an approach to be adopted also by other jurisdictions?
Sorry, is that to me first?
Please go ahead.
Yeah, possibly. I mean, I have to be honest. I've always said I always say to operators, you have to know your customers, particularly when it comes to protecting players, because there will be cultural differences in terms of gambling and how people approach gambling, their attitudes and expectations about advertising, marketing. But, and it isn't a case of one size fits all. But sometimes I think, looking at the pragmatics of the situation, that's a good way to do things. I mean, I'm not somebody that is for outright banning and prohibition, because I do think, if we go historically where there was just no regulated or even legal gambling industry, that didn't mean gambling didn't take place, and there were quite clearly problem gamblers even when we didn't have markets. So we know that gambling, problem gambling will always exist, irrespective of whether it's actually legal in a country or not. I do think when it comes to as I say, my views, I'm not anti advertising of gambling. I'm definitely anti advertising in terms of adolescents, because I've written 2 books on adolescent gambling, and we know that they're a vulnerable group. So for me, advertising should always be about, if we have advertising, how can we protect those vulnerable groups? And of course, the two most obvious vulnerable groups are minors and problem gamblers. We live in unfortunately now we live in a world where we're all walking around with smartphones, where we're possibly bombarded with direct marketing all the time from obviously not just gambling operators, but every kind of commercial operator. The kind of one size fits all and the idea of just banning things completely, I do think will have unintended consequences. And that's why I agree with this idea that channeling people to regulated gambling sites who we know have good levels of social responsibility infrastructure and good player protection is far better than leading those people towards the illegal markets. I've always said is that we should have good shared best practice, and if something works in one country and there's evidence for that, or at least perceived to be evidence for working for that, then that should be applied to other countries as well, to see how it works in those jurisdictions. But I do go back to what I said right at the start of answering your question, is that there will be cultural differences. And so this is why the kind of one size fits all isn't necessarily the approach that we should be taking.
Peter Paul, should the French approach now be something to be promoted in Holland, so to avoid a complete ban?
Let me be honest. I don't know enough about the situation in France to say that is a model that we should copy. In general, I would caution against copying regulatory systems from France, because I don't consider it to be a completely open, regulated market. But what I think you should do when you open a market, the market for online gambling, is first of all ensure that illegal operators are being shut down so that they cannot advertise. Start with Meta, start with Google. Those are the gateways to online gambling. Make sure that these illegal operators can no longer advertise through these channels. And then what you should consider, we are all for restricting, because you don't want to create this avalanche, and this avalanche will create a pushback from politics and from public opinion. This is all preventable. I have been, putting this little idea into the heads of the good people in Finland, because they are looking to regulate their market. What you could do, for instance, is say, listen, we're going to restrict the total volume of advertising on the market, and we'll do it in such a way that it doesn't distort competition. A way to do this would be to say, okay, depending on your market share, you are allowed a certain volume from the total cake that is available. This creates the beauty that those with a large market share have less possibility to advertise in favor of those that are new to the market and need to advertise to get their brand recognized by consumers as a trusted and responsible gambling brand. This doesn't distort competition. It in fact increases competition. It delivers consumer protection because it does continue to give consumers an idea of where they can gamble responsibly and with a safe and attractive operator. And I think that should be something that should be considered for any market opening up.
I think that's a very good suggestion, because we know, for instance, from Italy, where we have the ban that for bigger brands who do direct marketing, it's not such a big harm than for those newcomers whose brand is simply not known that much. So definitely a good approach, but you contradict yourself insofar that you say one shouldn't copy models. I think one should copy models if they are really good. Now, you also say one has to be careful, and of course one should be, but at the same time, if you look at the overall landscape of advertising provisions, you see a clear copy-paste. Someone comes up with, for instance, no advertising during the day for TV and radio, and the next jurisdiction more or less copies it. The same goes for sponsorships, the same goes for testimonials, the same goes for bonuses, and so on and so forth. So on the one hand, and I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing to do, but at the same time, one gets the impression also with this new provision now in Holland with the 18 to 25 years old that need more protection, which might be a good development, but is this really the answer, to just add additional provisions by creating kind of nearly a competition among regulators? Who does the most? Ellen?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, but I was just thinking whilst Mark and Peter Paul were talking, I think there's also a bit of a balance, really, because you either end up with regulations which are extremely prescriptive and leave no room for anybody to maneuver, or you have more open norms. And then, of course, the operators have to take the responsibility to fill those open norms in a way which, doesn't push the boundaries. But the regulators, I think, in those situations also have to take responsibility rather, and perhaps instead of immediately moving to enforcement, seek to clarify some of these more open norms. But I think also when you have fairly clear provisions, that doesn't mean that the regulator will not take a counterintuitive approach or seek to expand the scope of a particular provision beyond that which most other people would read on the basis of the text, on the basis of the explanatory text, which accompanies the provision. So we've seen a few things in the Netherlands where the Dutch Gambling Authority has come out with its interpretation on something which on paper looks pretty clear, but and it's not particularly a very open norm, it's quite a closed norm, but they still then push the boundaries of how they read something. So I'm thinking of their reading into cashback bonuses, their stance on autoplay, their stance on the fact that you, under the old legislation before the 1st of July, could not target young adults with advertising. Operators read that as we can still do it so long as we don't target them. And the Gambling Authority said, well, but the very fact that you send it to them, it's targeting. So I think it's not only a case of having sort of open or prescriptive norms, it's also a question of interpretation and communicating from the regulator to the industry, well, this is how we read things, and not immediately moving to enforcement. So there's sort of what's on paper in the law, and then what comes afterwards once the authority starts to take action, let's say. But indeed, it does sometimes feel like there's a bit of an arms race going on between different regulators as to who can be most, from an industry perspective, who can be most inventive or who can be most annoying, let's say, in terms of coming up with further restrictions. But at the same time, and looking at the questions which we circulated ahead of today's panel, there was something about, in cross-border situations with broadcasting and perhaps moving towards alignment. And I was thinking about that because I thought, well, you should be careful what you wish for as an industry, because as we all know, for many years now, there's no cross-border recognition of licenses. So what would alignment between regulators, jurisdictions bring? It's not going to bring any greater freedom to provide your services in another jurisdiction. It perhaps will only seek to relieve the burden that compliance teams face, and which standard will be the prevailing standard. And harmonization would then implies one standard or one very narrow window. Yeah, that might not be a window or standard which the industry particularly cares for. So in fact, given that member states or jurisdictions don't recognize the licenses that they all grant individually, it might be better not to go for harmonization, because you might end up with a very high standard that nobody likes, and therefore it might be better to have various jurisdictions going about the same thing in their own unique way, and therefore have the space to maneuver between, okay, I can't do this in France, but I do have the scope to do it in Spain, as opposed to having the space, as opposed to having no space to do it anywhere. So
Paul said more or less the same. So you two are pretty much in favor of still maintaining local systems. But let's just get to, for instance, the recommendations which were released back in 2014 by the European Commission. Couldn't that be the start of a common ground? And of course, there's a risk the standards might be very high, but perhaps based on the fact that if you have harmonization, even globally, like for instance, the UK regulator lately suggested, then you don't need these high standards anymore, because you can really effectively protect customers at a global level, because so far you had dozens of methods to circumvent a specific framework. That would be then not possible anymore. Mark.
Sorry, I'm not sure what you want me to comment on there, Annemarie. Sorry.
No, your view. Do you, like Peter, Paul, and Ellen, think it has to remain, the regulation has to remain at a local level, or could you see the beauty of a global standard?
Well, what I said earlier was, gambling operators have to know their clientele. Regulators have to know their own country. I'm sure there are some things that we can all agree on that any gambling operator should be there is, even though I've said the research evidence about advertising is of generally poor quality, we know who are the most vulnerable groups. I mean, that's universally accepted in terms of problem gamblers and minors. And so any gambling regulation will want, you know, in any country will want to minimize it, to minimize harm for those groups and to protect those players. But there will always be some things that have to be done on a jurisdiction by jurisdiction basis, because, you know, people in different jurisdictions, you know, operate in different ways. You know, that, so yeah, I'm basically agreeing what Alan says. I'm agreeing what Peter Paul says. But that doesn't mean there can't be some overarching regulations that we have that we know are based on good empirical data.
Okay.
If I can respond, if I can respond to this, Annie. So I'm not wearing a European flag without a reason. You know, I'm all for harmonization, because I don't believe that consumers from across the European Union are any different. You know, whether you're looking at someone from Poland or from Italy or, you know, from Germany, we all have the same interest, and we all need to be protected against harms. But, you know, unfortunately, in European gambling, there has been an intended carve out to ensure that there is no harmonization in gambling regulation. And, you know, you could question whether this is in the interest of consumers, or this maybe is protecting some other interest. You know, so and what Alan was pointing towards is, I don't think that we in the Netherlands want to be held to the same regulatory requirements as currently, for instance, are in Germany. You know, you all get to the strictest denominator if you harmonize from Germany to the rest of European Union. So I wouldn't want to harmonize, for instance, the German regulatory system or the Dutch regulatory system for that matter. But, you know, going back to 2014, and unfortunately we can't go back in time, but that was a, you know, that was a fairly reasonable ground level, the green paper and the white paper and all that stuff. But unfortunately, that has all been done and dusted.
So we lost the opportunity, in your view.
Yes.
Okay. And I understand from what you say, the risk today is too high that standards would then even increase. Interesting for me, because I still think it's exactly the opposite, but you might be definitely right. We have just a couple of minutes left, and I wanted to make a last round. We heard already more or less what would be needed in your view to set a decent framework for advertising. But could you just sum up in 2 phrases what you think would be needed that we stop this ever increasing restrictions and come back to a more balanced approach towards advertising?
I mean, I'll jump in since no one else is jumping in. I mean, I think there are some things that, you know, we can start to agree on. I mean, I think we can talk about kind of content moderation. So, you know, we're not targeting the adolescents. There are watersheds. I mean, I'm very anti-adolescent gambling. I don't think there should be any gambling advertising before 9 p.m. In the UK, for instance, in sporting events, we've got advertising everywhere before and after sporting events, even in the middle of the afternoon. You know, there are things that we can look in terms of sponsorship. There are things, you know, I do think we have to look at bonuses and where they're going. Yeah, the hardest one is how we stop things proliferating on social media. I think Peter Paul was absolutely right. You know, we've got Google, Meta. These are places where lots of direct marketing is going, and they really have to be a stakeholder and part of that conversation. And then things like the use of celebrities, for instance. You know, we've outlawed them in the UK. In terms of popularizing gambling, that should be happening elsewhere. There's lots of things we can agree on, but there'll be lots of things that do come down to a jurisdictional level.
Andreas?
So I fully agree with that was already said, and I think it is important that we see advertising not only as a threat or a risk, but also as a chance or opportunity, because there is a market for gambling, which is why it needs to be regulated. And in order for players to move from the black market to the legal market, it must be possible to guide them to the legal offer. And I think this is the role of advertising. And in Germany, advertising for legal offers also means enforcing comprehensive player protection, since we have the new Interstate Treaty 2021. And perhaps this aspect can be brought into focus a little more at one point or another. On both parts, I mean, the legislator and the operators, so that advertising can also be seen as a clear way of setting oneself apart from the illegal market. I think that's an important thing I'd like to mention at the end.
Ellen?
Yeah, I think also the industry should look at itself and also take responsibility for its actions. And okay, maybe you have a license, maybe that's seen as a green light, but there should also be some moderation. You should also perhaps be aware of the debates and the discussions which are playing out in the jurisdiction instead of coming in from another jurisdiction, Malta, Curacao, probably not, but wherever, and going in blindly and just thinking, okay, we can advertise, so we're going to put the pedal to the metal and do as much as possible, but perhaps take a second to reflect on, okay, what's being discussed in that jurisdiction, what are the issues which are playing out, and not necessarily always push the boundaries to the max, because that's what causes the irritation, and that's what will cause the pushback. And in the end, you will just shoot yourself in the foot. So, yeah.
Very interesting point. Peter Paul?
Yeah, I agree with what Alan said. The industry should take responsibility, and in many cases they have at least tried. But I think what should happen is that there should be restrictions, but it should not be banned as a principle. Because advertising plays an important role in channelization, in recognizing the trusted and licensed brands. From research in the Netherlands, it shows that 67% of Dutch gambling consumers could not make a distinction between licensed and unlicensed gambling, and this is already 1.5 years into regulation. We should get Meta and Facebook, Facebook and Google to the table to ensure that they also do their bit, and we should refrain as much as possible. I heard Alan speaking about it, but I think we should refrain as much as possible from using open norms in gambling regulation. Whether this is about fulfilling the duty of care, or whether this is about, being moderate in your advertising. What is moderate? I mean, refrain from these open norms, make gambling regulations, strict, predictable, and clear to everyone who, is going to apply for a license.
I think we covered a lot during this hour. I just want to add what came to my mind. I think advertising is even more important if you have a very strict law, because then, for instance, like in countries like in France or in Portugal, or in Germany, where you have the same sports betting product more or less as a licensee, you need advertising. And I think what you mentioned at the end, Peter Paul, the regulator has also a duty to promote the controlled and licensed offer. Only then we achieve this channeling towards the regulated and the licensed offer. Thank you so much for being here with me today and for your insight and your expertise. Advertising will accompany us, I'm sure, for the next couple of years, and I hope to speak to you soon again. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Annemarie.
Thank you.
Thank you, Annemarie. Thank you, gentlemen. And for those who are in this meeting, if you maybe would like to address some questions, since you have these experts here, you just switch on your microphone or video and just shoot. Guess not. All right. So thank you everyone for joining, and then we will be back next month. Wishing you a lovely day ahead. Take good care.